I think we are ready to start. So thanks everyone for being for attending this seminar in big numbers. My name is Massimo Tavoni. I'm a professor in Milan, and I'm also the director of the RFF-CMCC European Institute on Economics and the Environment, who is hosting today's webinar at 4 p.m. Because we have speakers from far away on the West Coast, so we had to make sure everyone could participate in time. The topic of today webinar is, as I just said, the topic of green finance. Let me just go very quickly through a couple of introductory remarks and slides, and then I'm gonna pass the floor to our speakers and our panelists today. We have a great list of panelists, and so I don't want to take too much time away from them. I just wanted to give you a couple of background information. First of all, who we are. The European Institute on Economics and the Environment is a partnership, transatlantic partnership between two leading institutes, the Foundation CMCC, which is an Italian foundation working on climate change from the physical science and climate science, also all the way to the impacts and the economics. And RFF, Resources for the Future, an institute in the US who has done a lot of work on environmental economics and climate economics. And the two came together about 2 years ago, to create this European Institute, where we do research on a variety of topics related to climate change, economics, modeling, and environmental issues more generally. The topic for today specifically, we thought this would be, and indeed there's given the attendance, it seems a very hot topic. The question and the motivation was, will recovery programs from COVID lead to a build-up of carbon-intensive infrastructure at climate risk? Current infrastructure and the current economy is certainly carbon-intensive, and the recovery programs targeted at the existing infrastructure would just exacerbate the carbon lock-in. And so the question for us is, to what extent monetary and financial instruments could be used to steer a carbon lockout and not a carbon lock-in? And to do so, of course, there are various angles and various ways at looking and analyzing this issue, which is relatively complex. And we want to take three viewpoints. The first one is, do recovery programs align with climate goals? What's the situation around the world? What do we know about it? And the second is, to what extent can central banks and more generally financial supervisors do to help fostering green investments and consumer spending towards green products? And second, how to enhance climate disclosure. Disclosure is missing, but it's a very important part of today's debate, because without it, it's going to be very hard to measure progress and to ensure that companies who are moving in the right directions are appropriately rewarded, and the opposite as well. So these three motivating questions and three foci will be the focus of today's talk, and we have three speakers who essentially are going to take up each of one. Barbara for the first, even the second, and Sara the third. I'm going to come to our speakers in a second, since we're very proud of having a great list of panelists today. More procedural questions, we're going to have Q&A sessions after the talk, so we're going to have 10 minutes talk. And then for the last 20, 15 minutes, we're going to have Q&As from the floor for myself. It's of course, an opportunity for you, and there are many of you, almost 200 people right now that I can see in the dashboard, to ask questions. You can use the questions tab on the GoToWebinar control panel on your right. You just type in your questions, and make sure someone whose mic is actually not mute. And make sure that you write your questions clearly, and if possible, please also identify yourself. That would also help targeting the question. And if you have a specific question to a specific panelist, please do so, say so. Let me also say that, of course, some little publicity about forthcoming additional webinars. CMCC is doing a webinar on the oceans and nature-based solution for coastal defense, and that will be on July 13th at 5 p.m. European time. You can register on our website for webinars. The webinar will be recorded, this webinar, and we are available on our YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is ended. So with that, I will stop here, and I don't want to take too much time away from our speakers, let me just stop sharing my screen. And let me just turn to our first panelist. It's a great pleasure to have Barbara Buchner here with us today. Barbara, she's the director of the Climate Policy Institute in the US, in California. Actually, before starting the meeting, we were chatting about how long we've known each other. Started working in 2005, actually on a small project together already on some of the topics, which are coming back right now on the transition towards an hydrogen economy. Anyway, Barbara has done a great career besides having collaborated together and long-standing collaborator. She's done a tremendous career, and she's probably one of the most experienced fellows and academics that know the questions and landscape of climate finance through her institute. So I would just give the floor to you, Barbara, for your remarks on the first question. What do we know about recovery programs and to what extent they do align or not with climate goals?
Great. Thank you so much, Max. It's a true pleasure being here on this webinar, at least virtually back in Italy. It's really great to be here with this fantastic panel. And as you said, I'm Barbara Buchner. I lead an advisory and analytical organization called Climate Policy Initiative. What do? We work with governments, financial institutions, and businesses to really drive economic growth while addressing climate change. And we're particularly known for tracking sustainable investment trends, for identifying innovative business models, and for supporting the solutions that can drive a transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. And I'd like to, in the next 10 minutes, just give you a little framing of where we stand today and what we know and how can we really, in a way, combine climate action with this green recovery in the aftermath of this COVID-19 crisis in the recovery area. So let's get started. And I think just like as a general framing, I think for us, it's crystal clear that the COVID crisis is a wake-up call for our social and financial systems to really be better prepared for the climate crisis, which will be bigger in every way and stay with us over a much longer period of time. Because unfortunately, the threat of climate change that is staying to be with our societies and with our economies for a much longer time. Particularly, it will remain for the most vulnerable societies. And so in order to build back better after the COVID-19 crisis, we need to respond as an international community in a manner that lays the foundation for long-term green, resilient, and inclusive recovery. And I really strongly believe that finance is the cornerstone for making this happen. So sustained green resilient recovery from COVID-19 requires significant investments to scale and to achieve an economy-wide transformation, again, particularly in developing and emerging economies. But what we know today, and if you look at the latest figures from Bloomberg, we know that green measures account for less than 0.2% of the total coronavirus-related stimulus spending allocated by the world's 50 largest economies so far. So clearly, we're not yet there. But what I want to focus on is that the opportunity is there. What we know is that over the next 18 months, we'll have around 10 to 20 trillion US dollars that will be spent, and recovery strategies can really put us on track for sustainable growth and for climate neutrality. We know the stimulus measures built on climate action can create jobs. They can boost GDP, but they can also cut emissions, they can expand energy access, and they can also foster biodiversity. Finally, they can really lay the foundations for a healthy, inclusive long-term prosperity. But the question obviously is how. And I think what we've been looking for and what we're trying to do, our work is really understanding as governments roll out plans and cash for economic stimulus and for enhancing social society safety nets, how can we ensure that these actions are also consistent with addressing climate change? And I think the main key takeaway for us is that mainstreaming climate action into regular decision making is the need of the day. And I'd like to focus on 4 elements here, share with you a little bit where we see specific actions that we feel can really make this happen. The first one, and I think one of the most important ones certainly, is good policies. I think good policies are key to resourcing a sustainable and resilient recovery. we have looked into that into more depth, and we see that green fiscal policies like pricing carbon, like reforming fossil fuel subsidies and procurement policies, but also green budgeting can be an important element in a government's COVID-19 response toolkit. Why? That the fact is that such approaches really support countries in removing inefficiencies in public expenditures and raising additional revenues, which can be directed towards immediate relief measures, while also supporting medium to long-term sustainable recovery planning that are aligned with climate objectives. I think another fact in this context is that the current low oil price and the need to rebuild fiscal positions make carbon taxes and eliminating fossil fuel subsidies particularly opportune. Just as an example, for many countries, $75 per ton of carbon tax would increase the pump prices by less than the recent collapse in global oil prices. And that could be combined with a number of other complementary measures like rebates or energy efficiency improvements or smart communication or assistance for low income and vulnerable households and communities. But in addition to these ideas, we also think that innovative thinking must be welcomed into fiscal policy for larger scale deployment of public finance for low carbon resilient recovery. And in this context, we think that perhaps some governments can take advantage of the likely permanent decline in the price of oil and eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, and then use the savings to essentially pay back a recovery bond that can provide significant funding to both enhance social safety nets, but also accelerate retirement of coal power plants or upgrade efficiency and resilience of buildings. And again, these are all areas where we really can also use the new workforce, the skilled workforce, and address the high unemployment that we can see around the world. Or perhaps governments could also consider debt for climate swaps that enable developing countries to utilize proceeds from reduced external debt to finance the national climate action, adaptation, and mitigation plans, and put policies in place that can accelerate resilient net zero pathways. So I think that's a little bit around the first element, the good policies which really can lead the way. The second element I'd like to spend a little time on is development finance. I think we really need an enhanced and a better role for development finance. Why? Again, in our work, what we see is that today the majority of global public climate finance is raised, managed, and distributed by development finance institutions. Development finance is key to both amplifying and deploying the investments needed for a green recovery in developing countries. And we see that development banks and international finance institutions can really help build strategy and support policy developments, but they can also deploy a wide range of instruments to manage, to share, but also to reduce risk in that context and really attract other additional pools of capital. But they can also convene the relevant stakeholders and decision makers across both the public and private sectors. And through all these activities, they can greatly enhance what the private sector can do. So we see a real need to expand the ability of development banks and international financial institutions, as this is by far the cheapest and the least risky way of enhancing low-cost finance. So what is needed there? I think we need innovation in how the public financial institutions themselves do business, and in order to catalyze more investments. So what can they do at the strategic level of their institutions in terms of incentives and targets to increase their focus on the most transformative approaches, but also how can they really work closely with governments to improve the enabling environments that then really in turn can again attract other pools of capital, particularly from the private sector. And I think finally what we need to do is to ensure that the crisis toolbox that these institutions currently put together and their ability to take higher levels of risk, that they really are sticky, and so in a way that they allow development and climate action to go hand in hand into the future. The third element I'd like to very briefly dwell on is the toolbox. Again, I think we need to improve the toolbox to use public resources in a more transformative way. And we need in this context innovative business models and financial instruments that can enable private investment at scale. And we need to speed up the effort to prepare a pipeline of shovel-ready projects that combine climate action with the economic recovery. And just one example of how to come up with such solutions are public-private initiatives such as the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance that my organization CPI manages, and that is regarded as the most successful climate finance incubator to date. And just again, as a small clarification of why and what can these types of initiatives do. Since the lab started in 2014, we have developed more than 40 financial instruments and business models that have mobilized collectively more than $2 billion for concrete projects in emerging economies. And many of these instruments combine blended finance approaches where public finance financiers, public investors, impact investors, and institutional investors really work to together to overcome the financing barriers that currently keep money from going into this climate relevant activities. So again, I'd love to talk also more about some of the specific examples, maybe in the Q&A segment, if that's of interest. And I will share also the website of the lab in the chat function after my intervention here. And just the fourth element before I'm closing up, and I know we will hear more about that from our other co-panelists today, but we need a real shift in the financial system. So just coming back to my earlier mainstreaming point, ultimately all financial institutions need to align their portfolios with an inclusive, sustainable and resilient future, and climate needs to be taken into account in every financial decision. So the entire financial system needs to better respond to but also help reduce and manage both physical and transition risks that are triggered by climate change. And at the heart of this work is really transparency, is a comprehensive reporting on climate risk and moving towards standardized mandatory disclosure, but also we need to have some better improved risk management and better capacity within the financial institutions, within financial industry. And again, I look forward to hearing more from our co-panelists on these issues. So just to sum up, I think what we've seen now, really following what is going on in the context of the COVID crisis, in the context of its recovery phase, we need systemic solutions. We are at the moment just seeing the tipping point of the iceberg of what's needed. We really need to work much more to go beyond these incremental changes, and we need to go beyond the leaders that are currently showing that green recovery packages are possible. And in order to come up with these systemic solutions, I believe that there are three key ingredients that can make this happen. First, and you've heard it throughout my talk, innovation. I think we need innovation policies, we need innovation regulatory frameworks in institutions, in instruments and business models. It's really time to think outside of the box and come up with disruptive, innovative approaches that can help achieve these dual goals of climate action and economic recovery. Second, we need global cooperation. We need a precedented collaboration, moving away from a siloed approach to really solve multiple problems with one approach. And third, of course, we need finance. And so to conclude, I think we really have a window to rebuild our world for a more inclusive, for a more resilient, for a more sustainable future. We have an opportunity to mainstream climate change considerations into the entire finance ecosystem, targeting both the short-term economic recovery, but also the long-term structural changes aligned with sustainable inclusive growth and with strengthening the society's resilience. Not doing so would really pose a significant threat to a sustainable recovery and would also risk intensifying the future systemic shocks that are brought about by the impacts of climate change. So I think there's a lot of work we need to do, and I really look forward to discussing with all of you on how can we contribute to making this happening. And thanks so much for your attention. And again, Max, it's great to be here with you.
Thanks, Barbara. Terrific talk. It's really motivating talk to think of us in the long term about what kind of alignment we want between this crisis and the biggest environmental crisis. We are raising a lot of points that we're going to certainly return back after in the Q&A sessions. We're going to go through our two other speakers right now, and then we're going to come back to you. I have a lot of questions personally, but I'm sure the floor will have as well. Thanks for that. Let me turn now to our second speaker. I'm very happy to have Ivan Faiella with us today. Ivan is a senior economist at the Bank of Italy. He has done a lot of work at the bank on energy and climate policies over many years, crossing paths a lot of times, and most recently he has been working a lot on the extent to which monetary and financial institutions can actually help in the transition. So I'm really keen and eager to know to what extent financial instruments and central banks and other financial supervising institutes can help earmarking these recovery funds towards inclusive and sustainable policies.
Okay, thanks, Massimo. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. Thank you for Barbara. You know, the financial sector was involved in this, you know, environmental arena rather recently. I think it's a couple of years now, and most of involvement was regarding, you know, the risk arising from climate change. I think that when COVID shocked our economy, we were doing really a lot of things as central bankers, as regulators. Even, you know, it's pretty new for us. I mean, it's an argument. I'm an environmental economist, so I'm a kind of a strange beast within the central bank. By the way, I need to do a disclaimer. This is just my personal opinion, not the opinion of the Bank of Italy, even if often our opinions are aligned. Hopefully, also this time. Sorry for that. And you know, so that's something that is really new because many reasons. The first one, obviously, is that the time horizon. We are not at the central bank. Our longer time horizon is 5 years, 2 to 3 years, 5 years at the maximum. So these things are more are different, and there is also a kind of cultural issue here in terms of having a lot of attention, for example, to the labor market or to capital markets, and less attention to other topics like, for example, energy markets that are very important anyway. After COVID, we experienced something I think it's pretty strange. There is a kind of a resilience of sustainable investment. There is a nice paper from a colleague, from a couple of colleagues of the Bank of Italy, Fabrizio Ferrani and Filippo Natoli, that are investigating how the ESG funds behave during the crisis. And actually, the strange thing is that there was an inflow towards these funds. I mean, that's not big news because we know from the literature that that kind of funds are more resilient during a crisis for many ways, because maybe the firms that operate in that sector are operating in sectors that are less sensitive to the business cycle. But that's a kind of interesting story, because it can be an interesting story that is telling us that transition is going on, and even the crisis is not stopping but can be eventually accelerating that. Nevertheless, I have to be blunt about that. Obviously, in normal times, the real economy is going towards a given direction in terms of allocating resources, and the finance follows. So that the point that were made before by Barbara, taking advantage of low oil and other fossil fuel prices, would be a great chance to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, to put carbon taxation. I just want to remind that at the global level, carbon taxation is in the is amounting to something like $2 per ton. I mean, something that is very, very insufficient if we want to really give a proper price signal to reduce emissions. So, I mean, that in normal times that would be the case. These times are not normal. We know that there will be we're going to need a lot of money to do this transformation. So the idea is to jumpstart the financial sector to help the other parts of the other policymakers to shape the decarbonization process. This is kind of tricky. It's kind of tricky because the point is that usually these guys, for example, people at the central banks, have other objective in terms of price stability, in other countries in terms of GDP growth, and or financial stability. In terms of financial stability, I think it's pretty clear to everybody, including the US, I would say, given the many intervention from people from the different Federal Reserves, that climate risk is a real issue, both in terms of physical risk, that is experienced by many countries now. No, it's not going to be experienced in the future, as well as transition risk, because we are learning that things can change quickly, very quickly, so we have to be prepared. There is an important issue, that is the issue of data. I mean, we are navigating sometimes we are kind of blind. So in all this discussion, it's nice to have people, climate expert. It's nice to have financial expert from finance. Then Sara is going to telling us something about disclosure. Everybody is needed. I would like to have also on board statistical agencies. I think that we are lacking somehow sometimes very basic information regarding, for example, energy expenditure of households and the expenditure of firms. That are going to be key if we have really to evaluate what is going to be, for example, the effects of a carbon taxation in terms of competitiveness, in terms of financial vulnerability of households, so on and so forth. So that's really something that I spend a lot of time in trying to estimate these things. That said, it's a challenge. We are ready to take the challenge. What is the possible role of a central bank? I think I can see three roles, and the first role is increase awareness in terms inside the bank, inside the process. So it means in the research department, using models that usually are DSG models, or the models that are used to assess financial stability or to do projection for monetary policy, also connecting some of these models with the potential effects of climate change in terms of physical or transition risk. And we are just cooperating with the NGFS. Now we have the NGF scenarios out. I think that this great step forward. Is still a work ongoing, because it's just we're just modeling the world. Then in the next release we should have something more detailed. But it's a first step to have a flavor of what we are talking about, because when you want to translate, to put together this word, is not always easy. Increase awareness also in terms as a supervisor, so talking with banks, looking what's the degree of awareness in terms of knowledge, in terms of using the scenarios, for example. So we are regularly, for example, serving our banks, and the situation, the bigger banks are pretty aware about that. There are very nice studies out there trying to evaluate how the risk appetite of the bank can tackle the problem of climate risk. But smaller banks are struggling with that, because there are clearly transaction costs and scale costs to do this kind of analysis. But anyway, everybody, I think, is every month, we can see that the problem is really considered serious in terms of risk and also in terms of opportunity, because obviously there is also opportunity. Then there is, apart from the awareness and so the participation also in the international activities on climate, there is the leading by example. In this sense, the bank since 2019 is managing its own portfolio, so not the monetary policy portfolio that is shared with the ECB, obviously, but its own portfolio using a ESG criteria. In doing that, we know that ESG are not a panacea. There are many problems. For example, some firms with very high ESG scores are big emitters, so we have to be aware of that. But we are trying to improve our approach to all this problem. But we are aware that there is a problem. We think that you have to put your money where your mouth is, and that's rather important. And then from the institutional point of view, while for financial stability, as I said, is difficult, but it's clear that we have a momentum to define, for example, a kind of stress test. Other countries are doing, the Deutsche Bank started, is the leading example, a top-down stress test, mixing macroeconomic effects with effects on credit demand and vulnerability at the bank level. We are also performing something a bit different. There is a bottom-up stress test that is, looking how, for example, a carbon taxation can change the financial vulnerability of households and firms. and try to translate that in a PD. It's not easy because you need a lot of assumptions. As I said before, you also need to do a lot of estimation because of data lacking. But we are learning a lot in doing this exercise anyway. It's a bit more tricky for monetary policy. We are participating as member of the European system of European Central Bank of European banks to the the revision of the monetary policy framework. There is a climate work stream. So in this sense, we are monitoring also the statistical need to inform and the modeling need to inform our standard framework of monetary policy of what are the possible effects of climate change, effects on long-term TFB, effects on on inflation, for example, if we imagine to have an ever-increasing energy prices, for example, due to carbon taxation. This is ongoing. We should, it was postponed because of the COVID, but we should have a new policy framework by the beginning of the next year. As you can read from the print, the president of the ECB is rather keen in using also the so-called QE, quantitative easing, to give a signal. In that sense, there are some studies in the literature. It is not clear that the QE is the right instruments to bend the markets. Usually, the central bank is constrained somehow to be market neutral. What does it mean? It means that we don't want to play with the market. We just want to be aligned to what is out there. Actually, what is out there is clearly market neutrality is not aligned at all with carbon neutrality. So there can be a step forward, try to improve this alignment. Even as I said before, there is an issue of be sure that this act from the financial institutions that are a different purpose and role are aligned with the acts of people that is in charge of deciding the energy and climate policy. What do I mean? I mean that if I'm suggesting, for example, it's a very good idea to phasing out from coal, because according, for example, Italy is going to do that by 2025, and I suggest that every investor should be aware that it's a big risk investing in coal. Let's imagine what's going to happen if in 2024 the government changes mind. So we need to work together. We need to align our priorities. I think that the central banks, we're kind of laggards because, but we are rather practical guys, so we are fully on board. I think that also the quality of the exchange of information between European central banks, but also with central banks outside the Eurozone are excellent. And working with NGFS was really enlightening for me, and everybody is on board. Now also, like for the recovery, we think it's important that the financial sector plays a role. We are expecting also, for example, at the European level, some news on the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies, some news eventually on a floor price for ETS, some news in improving the energy taxation directive, setting up a carbon price for non-ETS emissions. So in that sense, we are ready to go, but we also, we need action also from other entities that are not under our control and with which we want to cooperate completely 100%. I think that Sara is telling us a lot of interesting stuff because I said before, data are key. So whenever we think that, for example, our colleagues at the Monetary Policy Department will have to decide, for example, for the collateral framework, to decide if the degree of climate risk of a given bond or asset, we know that we need precise information from the firms regarding emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, regarding climate strategies, so on and so forth. So in a sense, Sara, she's the last panelist, but her topic is the first one. And I think it's really the game changer is going to increase the quality and the quantity of information that is available at the firm level, and then can inform a better decision for the financial players as for the government and all the other business players.
Thank you, Ivan. This was very clear. showing to what extent financial institutions like the Bank of Italy can help in facilitate this process and this dialogue, and can also act on its own as leading by example, as you just mentioned. So let's turn now to our last speaker, partly already introduced by Ivan. It's a great pleasure to have Sara Lovisolo with us. She's the sustainability manager at the London Stock Exchange, and she's going to talk about disclosure, which, as we just heard, is just key. Without it, it's very hard to make any decisions. And she's certainly very well placed to do so, because she has been one of the experts within the European Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, whose work is just about to end. So we look forward to hear any news on financial disclosure in Europe.
Thank you, Massimo, for the invitation, and even for the kind words that are a nice segue into the third focus of this webinar. So my task is to answer the question, can we enhance the focus on climate resilience and mitigation, so the fight against climate change, as we recover from the coronavirus crisis? And why should that be the case? I would add, because I believe that one thing that is coming out of this crisis is clearly the expectations from the wider public, from retail investors, that the coronavirus crisis will shift our focus on social issues, kind of offsetting the focus on climate that has been at the center of many policies and of many investment framework and decisions. So first of all, we've seen governments understanding the link between the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis and let's say the mitigation challenge, or the need to continue to invest in the response to the climate crisis. And we've seen also governments understanding the link between the need for data and the response to the coronavirus crisis. To give you an example, in Canada, the government has conditioned, has linked the access to funds for solvency purposes, for helping businesses, to bail out businesses that are facing liquidity problems due to the coronavirus crisis, has linked the access to those funds to disclosures from those businesses against the TCFD, so the recommendations from the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. This framework, the disclosure framework, is not, a basic framework. It's quite sophisticated. Not many businesses currently disclose against that framework. In Canada, the government said, if you want access to these funds, you commit to disclosing against this quite sophisticated framework that is solely focused on climate. Example from the EU. So the very large facility that has been made available. So 750 billion from this Next Generation EU package, which also includes a facility specific for solvency problems, to address solvency problems also from SMEs, embeds a green oath to do no significant harm. And also there are guidelines for green investment aligned with the EU Green Deal. These are commitments. We don't know what exactly will be required of businesses but very likely the requirement will be around disclosures. So we see this attempt from governments to use tools that derive from the financial sector, that have been developed by the financial sector to address climate change, and to reuse them, to retool them to address the COVID-19 recovery. The problem is that many of these tools sometimes are either addressed for those companies or those sectors of the economy that have a significant impact on the fight against climate change. So for those sectors like the TCFD that have a significant exposure to climate-related risks, or other tools like the taxonomy that are designed for those sectors that significantly contribute to the fight against climate change. So TCFD, example of disclosure framework designed for high carbon sectors. Taxonomy, example of framework designed mainly, but it's not, let's say, it's more complicated than that, designed for sectors that significantly contribute to the transition to a low carbon economy. And we know at the same time that the sectors that need funds for the recovery can belong to any sectors that we can consider as gray. So think about the hospitality sector that has been badly hit by the crisis. One of the elements that is most promising in this, retooling of frameworks and theories of change for the purposes of the recovery from coronavirus, I believe, and I see signs also from policymakers, is the principle of do no significant harm. It's an impact principle, not so much a financial stability principle. And the do no significant harm principle states that when you do something that helps achieve a specific goal, a specific positive goal, like fight for climate change, or in the case of the coronavirus recovery, social objectives, what you also have to control for is the fact that the same effort does not damage significantly other objectives. Let's say environmental objectives or the circular economy, and this is, I think, something that can be applied universally. So by applying the do no significant harm principle, as in the EU Green Deal is the case for the Green Oath, you are not also having, let's say, collateral effects. This is, I think, quite promising. We are seeing, let's say, a shift from an approach that is based on financial stability towards an impact approach from policymakers in the EU, but not only in the EU. How can we understand whether there's not let's say, where significant harm is being made? This is where disclosures come in, where standards for disclosures are required, and it's, I think, the next stage of sustainability disclosure standards. So moving from very sector-specific KPIs that are just based on positive impact to a new series of disclosures that can reassure about the fact that at least a core series of objectives, both social and environmental, are not negatively affected by the investment. So I think this is going to be the next stage of disclosures, but we just have these examples, this series of criteria for environmental objectives. A lot of work has to be done to extend this approach to social objectives and to all sectors, not just those that either significantly damage the fight to climate change or those that significantly contribute. So this is the next stage. I think I stop here because I think we just have 10 minutes for the Q&A, and I think this is the most interesting part of the session. So I hand back to you, Massimo.
Thanks, Sara. Very clear, and thanks for outlining what are the initiatives ongoing on the disclosure side. Please, to all the panelists, if you can turn your video on, then I think we can all be online at the same time and visible. I think I remind everyone who is interested in asking questions to the panel to do it in the chat. I try to jiggle around between few questions to you and looking at the questions. Maybe just to start, we heard a lot, a big call for innovation here from everyone. I think in the back of our minds, everyone is thinking, well, as this pandemic, which was in a way somehow anticipated, has come a bit too early in the sense that we see there's a build-up of interest in climate change at various levels, but we also see that we are lagging behind in terms of institutional capacity, in terms of data, in terms of our culture, or just our capacity of institutions to solve these problems. One of the things that often comes up when you look at this is, and it certainly has come up again with COVID even more so, is to what extent these climate goals align well with other sustainable goals. And by sustainable, I just don't mean environmental goals, but also more social goals. I mean, Barbara, you talked a lot about inclusiveness, which talks about a lot of these elements that go beyond just the environmental sustainability elements. And I was wondering if you could briefly, all of you could outline how you think this recovery, and of course the crisis has impacted our societies very profoundly socially. It has had uneven impacts across countries, within countries, further exacerbating existing inequalities and adding on top of existing inequalities, and potentially also has diminished some of the appetite for reforming and accepting climate policies. To what extent is, in your views, the innovation needed, and what are the challenges in combining this climate objective with other social objectives, which of course are extremely relevant for policymakers and politicians? If we can have a brief discussion about this, and then I'll go for specific questions. I believe on the table, starting from Barbara.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, and thanks so much to Sara and Ivan for really fascinating discussions and reflections on what is needed. And just to say on these points, I completely agree that data is key. I think what you can't manage, you can't measure. What you can't measure, you can't manage. So I think working more on these issues will really be important. And in this context, I think, Massimo, I think what we've certainly seen in our work here is that social and economic, for the first time actually, social and economic and environmental elements are really really kind of linked more than ever. I kind of feel particularly social and economic sustainability have to be considered much more in our approaches. And I think in the immediate relief measures and in the immediate kind of rethinking and how we build better, we need to put social at the cornerstone. And I think we need to make sure that, again, if you just think about some of the recovery measures now, I think we need to make sure that we really focus on green jobs, on how can we also build back a better, basically how can you make sure that the large labor force which currently is unemployed because of COVID really is kind of better integrated in this green recovery planning, and that we really come up with measures that address also, you know, the short-term difficult challenges. And again, you know, just talking about, for example, you know, accelerating coal retirement, which I think is extremely important and really needs to, you know, be at the core of some of our longer-term planning now, because I think this is a moment to accelerate the transition that we've had. So I think we need to make think much more on what does that actually mean for the workers, what does that actually mean for the industries, and how can we come up with additional complementary measures that can really ensure that we are, you know, taking into account and taking care of the workers, but of the society more generally, as we are kind of trying to build back better. And I think it's both the unemployment part, but and the workers part. But I think in addition, it is also about the society's resilience. I think we need to think more about how can we connect climate action to, you know, action on biodiversity and other, you know, the broader kind of themes that I think we have seen at the end are like, you know, really kind of at the core even of you know, health crisis like COVID-19. So I think we need to kind of expand our own horizon a little bit to take much more care of that. But again, for me, in a nutshell, the big certainly what we've learned is that the social in the, you know, sustainability 3 pillars is actually something we might not have always been taking care of that well, and I think it needs to be taken much more seriously into account.
You know, central banks have worked on employment, of course, as you were mentioning, and labor markets even. So maybe this is a role for central banks to discuss. I think you're muted.
This guy working at the central bank in particular on energy poverty, your question is rather stimulating, because apart from the unemployment point made by Barbara, you know, we know that the transition is going to be expensive. I mean, we're in a way or the other, or constraining the present energy sources, or putting, as we said before, a price on carbon. Energy prices probably are going to increase, at least in the short, medium term. So it would be very clever also in terms of another dimension of sustainability, if I may, that is political sustainability of the transition. I mean, the selling point of the transition, to see if there are policies, good policies, as Barbara said, that can serve both the purposes, not the social one and the environmental one. I mean, the one that is obvious to me is the energy revamping on social housing and all of public infrastructure, but social housing in particular. I mean, if you're expecting that electricity prices, gas prices are going to increase, what's the best? That, you know, try to improve the energy efficiency of the vulnerable people living there. This is going to improve their welfare. This is going to decrease their bill from now on. So instead of subsidizing, you know, every year with the bonuses, different bonuses, and, you know, with a lot of uncertainty, you just have a measure that is going to improve the quality of the capital owned by the public, and also reduce the energy bill of those households. And this is the first obvious policy. A second one is always have a kind of check of what's the distributional impacts of your energy and climate policies. We did a paper in 2015. You know, every time there is a proposal of a carbon tax, the first things that is, the first argument that is used by the people is opposing to the carbon tax. One is competitiveness, and the second one is that is regressive. Well, we compared a carbon tax on liquid fuels to finance renewables with the financing using the electricity bill, and was clearly the case that electricity bills are definitely more regressive, and it's obvious, no? Because very poor guys, I mean, they don't know a car. That's pretty simple. So, you know, that sometimes also we have to be clever in designing the policies, and, you know, always take into account that this transition must be just. But this, I wouldn't go just for, you know, for a kind of motto. must be just, it means that we have to be clever in designing the policy. And, you know, it's not a big deal. I mean, we can always find a way to be, you know, to be effective, and at the same time trying to lower the price that, you know, vulnerable people has to pay.
For sure. So Sara, just also following up some of the questions that are coming up. So where do you see the investment in this ESG ESG investment trend that you were outlining before? To what extent do you think people are, or investors are paying attention to which of these dimensions? More specifically, is it the environmental, the social? We clearly have to balance between various dimensions to ensure that the transition is sustainable. It's also just. And the question always comes up: can you build an index, or can you track all these different and sometimes competing dimensions?
Yeah, on the competing element, I'm not sure. So I think that if COVID-19 has not been just this crisis, climate change is going to be even less so. So the inequalities that will derive from climate change, I think are ready for us to see, because we see that, you know, it's the south of the world that is most affected. We see climate refugees already. So climate change per se will give rise to extreme inequalities, and fighting climate change is just per se, right? It's already a way to ensure that these inequalities do not skyrocket. Right. Then we can include in that, you know, in that transition, adjust this. The idea of just transition is can be interpreted in two ways. So the fact that you are redeploying workers from high carbon sectors to low carbon sectors, and this is the solution for the developed markets. The problem you have with the fight against climate change is that you might have to stop development in the south. So in the south of the world. So this is the real danger, that because you are so worried about climate change, you say, yes, people in India, people in Africa are not going to have the same level of well-being, of economic development as we have, because we cannot afford 4 planets. This as the story, as this is a possible danger from the fight to climate change. And the discourse on just transition never addresses this element. It mostly addresses the first one, the fact that you have to guarantee opportunities to people that are currently employed in the in high carbon sectors. So per se, you wouldn't find a trade-off between social and environmental goals. So you don't have this sort of conflicting objectives, but there are some elements of the fight against climate change that are probably well managed inside the Sustainable Development Goals. So there you see that climate change is a fight against climate change is one of the objectives, but you also have the fact that you want no poverty, education for all. And the problem is that those are not risks, but they have to be managed from an impact perspective. So it's very difficult to manage those objectives about equality and fight against poverty as a risk. You don't have the tools for that. You have always to address those in terms of impact, and it's so difficult for investment, for mainstream investment, to take that impact approach. So this is the problem. So we see investors trying to create taxonomies to ensure that they align their portfolios with the Sustainable Development Goals, but alignment is still is not impact yet. So this is, I think, the challenge we have.
Okay, thanks. Certainly we need to align policies. Say again.
Sorry, Massimo, can I just add one thing? I do think I want to just I think I just want to end on like a positive note, because I think you're fully right that the risk is there. But I think what we see is that actually, we've been talking to a lot of also developing countries, including, for example, Costa Rica, and they say themselves, look, it's in their own self-interest to do it. I think it is, I think we need to have the better data, but I think we also need to focus on the impacts really of investments and highlight, as Ivan said, that, how can you be more effective in actually coming up with smart policies and smart investments, and actually showing a broader range of indicators and metrics that highlight really that you are, actually it's a good business case for, doing a green recovery and a green investment. Sorry, just wanted to add.
And health being such a salient issues right now, many of such investments, including better housing, certainly have positive impacts on health. In terms of protecting from air quality or decreasing air pollution, which also are, as we have heard and learned, important cofactors of risk also in pandemics. So we have a few more questions coming in, but for the sake of time, given that we passed the hour and we typically want to be very strict in terms of timing, webinars have a tendency to go long, but everyone now has to jump between seminars, and I would like to again thank all the speakers for your talks. I think they were very helpful in outlining and clarifying some of the key issues we had laid out at the beginning of the talk. I remind everyone that this video will be streamed, so you have the chance to see it again if you have not, soon on our YouTube channel. Thanks again to the speakers, and if you have further questions, I think you can write to the speakers directly, and hopefully they will reply to you.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Thanks to everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.